It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Corinne Fowler, who is the Professor of Colonialism and Heritage at the University of Leicester. She's the co-investigator on the Rural Racism Project. She's also directed a project called Colonial Countryside, National Trust Houses Reinterpreted. And in 2020, she co-authored an award-winning National Trust report on its country houses and the connections to empire, which found that nearly a third of trust houses had some kind of link to colonial activity. Her latest book is Our Island Stories, 10 Country Walks Through Britain and Its Hidden History of Empire. So with that, I'd like to invite Corinne to the stage to talk about how local history is colonial history.
Thank you very much. Great to see so many people here. I want to start off by thinking about giving a kind of broad brush strokes overview of local places and their connections to empire, which are always unique, often multiple, and there's a lot of nuance around that subject. I thought a good way to start would be to mention a single day that I spent with colleagues in the Hold in Ipswich, where the archivist put in a single word, Jamaica, and came out with two huge trolleys, tottering piles of papers which are connected to the history of Jamaica. And aside from the story of the Long family, which had 6 generations of involvement with the slavery business, there was an incredible story which immediately opened up in front of us as we opened document after document of the 1830s, when after the official end of enslavement, there were some documents belonging to Cross and Ram solicitors, and it showed a land sale by local Suffolk people who owned land, a plantation in Jamaica, and it was a real struggle between the descendants of enslaved people who had been working that land for a long time and the owners of the land who considered them squatters. And there was a big argument that went on between the two groups, and as we kind of looked through all these papers, we found that incredibly the descendants of enslaved people won that argument. So it was a really great story, and that was just in one day, in 2 hours at the beginning of that day, and it went on from there. So there are really important stories to tell, and it's of course always vital to link up with your local archivists, who are usually delighted to be asked if they know anything or if they might be able to find things that might connect really well with collections. Another person who was there that day in Ipswich was the author of a book about Africans in East Anglia, which runs from 1467 to 1833. There are so many amazing stories there that might well connect with the museums across that region. This is a photo that Satnam Sangera, who I'm there with, who authored Empire Land and now Empire World, took at the beginning of a book of walks that I've written through the British countryside, opening up the colonial history of the countryside. And that house behind us is in Berkshire, which was once known as England's Hindustan, because there were so many former East India Company officials who were coming back from India and settling and buying, building, extending and expanding estates there, because they always liked to live together in quite a close circle. So my book, it's got a slightly, the paperback's coming out, so it's got a slightly different subtitle. The original subtitle is Country Walks Through Colonial Britain. But the idea of that book was really to walk through the British countryside and find out what unique stories came out in the different walks that I did across England, Scotland and Wales. And quite a lot of those are in the southern English area and in the southeast also. So I'll just mention some of those stories because it kind of brings out the full variety of the history. But the idea behind the book was to really not just walk on my own, but walk with companions who have ancestral connections to empire and for whom the history I was looking at was really resonant. And I wanted to really centre their view of the history and their relationship with those landscapes which they asked me to walk through with them. Here are some of the walks. So you can see that I've got walks connected to sugar in the island of Jura. I've got an opium walk through the Lake District connected to the Wordsworth family. I've got a tobacco walk along the Whitehaven coast, and then I've got cotton walks, wool walks, and an enclosure walk which is really connected to the Norfolk, Suffolk area. A banker's walk, which I'll mention, and a labourer's walk, and also a copper walk. So all of these bring out unique aspects of colonial history. And I think that it's also important to understand how our labour histories are integral to colonial history. They're not separate from it, and that's something I've tried to bring out in the book. Although this is not in the southeast, I just wanted to mention this because of the importance of coastlines in uncovering colonial stories of all kinds, because obviously the maritime story affects large portions of our countryside. This is my tobacco walk through Cumbria, which ends up in Whitehaven. And if you look in the port of Whitehaven, you can see that it has two parts built there. There is a shallow water docks for the coal ships, because often that story of that coastline is presented as a coal story, because it's the whole of that coastline is pockmarked with coal mines. But it's also a tobacco story, so it was the second most important tobacco port in the 17th and early 18th century. And that means that the area has loads of connections to Virginia and Maryland and all of those tobacco plantations which were cleared and worked by enslaved people. And this is another kind of object lesson in working with archivists, because this is the beginning and the end of 61 archival entries from the local Records Office, which show the presence of African people and people of South Asian descent, all listed in the archives. And there are so many stories to investigate and tell just in that tiny piece of coastline. And in fact, Whitehaven used to be more multicultural than it is today. So never assume that your place has always been a white place. Moving on to more familiar territory, I've got an enclosure walk because the history of enclosure is often presented as a domestic, local history. But actually, the history of enclosure is so closely connected to imperial wealth, whether that was from the Asian subcontinent or whether it was from Africa or from the Caribbean. And this is just one of many examples. So on my enclosure walk starts in Bungay, and that really opens up the story of Earlsham Hall and the fact that Earsham Hall, like many estates, were expanded with slavery wealth, and that meant pushing people off the common land where they might have grazed their cattle, taken flagstones from the common. They might have grown some crops. There's a whole kind of history of displacement which resounds across continents. And this is not to place the histories of landless people in Britain on a par with the history of enslaved people, because they are very different extremes of exploitation, but they are linked, and it's important to begin to open up what the history of those links, and not to think you either talk about labour and labour history, or the history of the British Empire and colonised places. It's not either or, it's both. This is just an illustration of how I found this out. So you can see there's an enclosure map, and there's a section from a kind of picture of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project. So if you could look at William Wyndham Dalling, the owner of that house, Earsham Hall, and then when you look on the enclosure records, you can see Dalling's name in various bits of that enclosure map. So sometimes you need to think a bit laterally about which things you're putting together. This is my banker's walk through Hampshire, and I walked with Dr. Ibrahim Sek, who comes from Senegal, but he is the senior researcher on Whitney Plantation in Louisiana. And what I wanted to do with this walk was to really join three parts of a triangle between Senegal, where many enslaved people in Louisiana came from, Louisiana itself, where he has completely redesigned the plantation to create a museum which centres the experience of enslaved people and the stories that he managed to follow across in 3 different languages, Spanish, English, and French, tracing what had happened to individuals who had worked on that plantation. It's a really, really brilliant example of stopping that awful trend where people go to these old plantation houses and have their wedding there. Why would you want to have your wedding in basically what was a killing field? It's a just baffling way to start married life. But anyway, it's the one that does go against the grain of that in really compassionate and powerful ways. Anyway, Ibrahim is not much of a walker, so I had to check on him every so often. He says he goes everywhere in his car, which he calls Malouf, after a former historical figure in Senegal. He's got Malouf the First, Malouf the Second, Malouf the Third. And we walked through Hampshire to explore the history of the Baring family, because the Baring family is very, very important in Hampshire. Of Baring Bank fame, which you'll probably remember, the collapse of Baring Bank after a rogue trader kind of made it collapse. But joining up these histories can be a really enriching thing, and that's why it's useful to do walks sometimes, because it's a way of grounding your research. But really, this is a story of the financiers who lived in Hampshire, who financed the plantation owners in Louisiana. So that's connected to Northington Grange and other places. I think it was quite an interesting experience doing this walk with Ibrahim, because When we got to Northington Grange, it's a very kind of eerie atmosphere. There's a sort of sense of an absent presence. It's very beautiful also. And when Ibrahim got there, he decided that even though said his feet were nearly falling off, he decided to walk all the way around the house and to reflect on the place's connection with people who, who were his ancestors. So it was, he went and had a very sort of reflective walk around the estate before we continued on our way. I think to sum up, really, there are so many things to say about museums and the assumptions we might make about what stories we have, and it just depends who's looking. And I think that one other thing is that even if in provincial settings across Britain, we should never underestimate the connection that they have to the larger colonial story. And there are so many questions you can ask. I mean, one of them is, who were the large-scale landowners in the region? Who were the benefactors? Who were the donors? The one story that came to light recently was the importance of missionary exhibitions and collections. That there's this whole kind of part-forgotten story about how missionaries went around raising money for their activities in Africa and elsewhere and in India. And in doing that, they would bring lots of items, which were like baskets or carved items, which they would then sell with their interpretation on them in order to raise money for their cause. So, you sometimes have to look at the provenance of collections, and you may have some of that there. Another useful thing is the National Trust report that we read, because if you read the report for your region, it's quite useful in getting a sense of what the local colonial stories are, and then it kind of gives you a clue and puts you on a trail. I mean, for example, do people know that, I've got 2 minutes, do people know that Norfolk was where enslavers bought up land so that they could then get access to Parliament in the rotten boroughs? Norfolk was one of the prime places alongside Cornwall. There are so many things I could say, but I think there are a couple of other things I want to add because I've only got a minute left. And one of them is that we should never assume that we are the best custodians of our collections, because those collections can be really, really resonant for people way outside our ambit. And one final thought that I want to leave you is that I recently went to Ghana because I was on a museums lab exchange between European and African museums. And we went to the National Museum in Accra. That's a national museum, and it was about the size of this room. That's the sum total of the collections that they have in their care. That's all they've got. Everything else has been taken, and we've got it in our museums. So never, ever undervalue what you've got in your collections in some back room, because that is something that is missing, that local school children can't go to see and learn about their past. So I would just end on that note.